Clara Maeve Thorne had always known the land would shape her fate, but nothing in her past could have prepared her for the day the wind changed and the world she knew began to unravel. The late autumn air in the Wind River Valley carried a different kind of chill that year, a sharp-edged cold that promised a long and brutal winter. It whispered through the skeletal branches of the cottonwood trees along the creek, a sound like a final, drawn-out sigh, and swept across the vast, empty plains where the tall grasses had faded to a pale, brittle gold. For Clara, it was a constant, mournful reminder of all she had lost. 6 months had passed since she had stood on the small knoll overlooking their homestead and watched as the last shovelful of earth covered Daniel's simple pine coffin. The dull thud of dirt on wood, a sound that still echoed in her quietest moments. The silence he left behind was not an absence of sound, but a palpable presence, as real and as heavy as the granite peaks of the mountains that loomed on the horizon, their jagged edges cutting into the vast, indifferent sky. Her life had become a quiet ritual of survival, a series of tasks performed with a methodical grace that masked the deep, persistent ache for grief. She moved from the cabin to the barn, from the well to the woodpile, her hands, once soft and accustomed to the gentle weight of a book, now calloused and strong. Every task was steeped in memory. The axe handle felt familiar in her grip because Daniel had taught her how to split the wood just so, his warm hands guiding hers, his voice a low murmur in her ear. Let the weight of the axe do the work. Clara, don't fight it. The scent of hay in the barn brought back the summer they had worked side by side, their laughter echoing in the rafters as they raced to bring in the harvest before the rains came. The homestead, their shared dream built from sweat and timber and whispered promises in the dark, now felt less like a home and more like a fortress she was tasked to defend alone. Each morning, she would force herself to look out at the land, at the endless expanse of sagebrush and sky, and find the will to face another day. The pressure was not just from the coming snows. A small, heavy box on the mantelpiece held a growing collection of letters from the bank in Cheyenne. That evening, she took one out, the crisp paper cold to the touch. The words, printed in an impersonal, precise script, swam before her eyes: mortgage, arrears, foreclosure. It was a language of commerce and law that felt utterly alien in a world that should have been governed only by the sun, the seasons, and the soil. She traced the signature of a man named Jedediah Croft, a name she didn't know. Yet he held the fate of her world in his hands. The first snow arrived not with gentle grace, but with a sudden, violent fury. The sky, which had been a clear, pale blue at dawn, turned the color of a deep bruise by midday, the clouds churning in a low, menacing mass. The wind began to howl, a low, guttural moan that escalated into a piercing shriek, driving a blinding curtain of white horizontally across the valley. It was a storm that devoured the landscape, erasing the familiar lines of the hills and the distant peaks, shrinking Clara's world to the four walls of a small, sturdy cabin. The cattle huddled together in the lean-to, their backs to the wind, their lowing calls lost in the gale. The chickens were silent in their coop. She secured the shutters, the wood rattling under the force of the assault, and stoked the fire until it roared in defiance, its light casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the log walls. Settling into her rocking chair, the one Daniel had made for her, its rhythm a lonely comfort, she felt the weight of her solitude pressing in on her more than ever. It was a dull, rhythmic thud from the direction of the barn that first broke through the storm's cacophony. At first, she dismissed it as a loose shutter or a heavy branch thrown by the wind. But the sound persisted, too regular to be random, a desperate, muffled beat against the roar of the storm. A cold needle of fear pierced through her calm. A lone woman in an isolated homestead was a beacon of vulnerability. Every story she had ever heard from traveling peddlers or whispered in town came rushing back tales of desperate men, outlaws on the run, or miners broken by misfortune. Men who would see her small, stocked homestead as a prize for the taking. Her hand tightened around the heavy iron poker she kept by the hearth. Its weight a small, cold comfort. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she lit a lantern. Its warm, golden light a fragile shield against the swirling chaos outside. She wrapped her thickest wool shawl around her shoulders, pulled on Daniel's old oilskin coat. It still smelled faintly of him, of pine and honest sweat, and stepped out into the blizzard. The wind tore at her, stealing her breath and plastering her dress to her legs with icy fingers. The snow was a disorienting wall of white, and she fought for every step, her world reduced to the small dancing circle of lantern light at her feet. When she finally reached the barn, she had to use all her strength to force the door open against the wind and the snow that had drifted against it. The lantern light cut through the dusty darkness, casting long, dancing shadows, and her heart stopped. There, slumped against a stack of hay bales, was the figure of a man. He was large, dressed in a dark, well-made coat that was stiff with ice. His face, shadowed by a dark, untrimmed beard, was as pale as the snow clinging to his shoulders. For a long, silent moment, she was certain he was dead. The poker felt heavy and useless in her hand. Then, as the light wavered across his face, she saw it a faint, almost imperceptible cloud of vapor leaving his lips. He was alive. Every rational instinct, every lesson of survival her father had taught her, screamed at her to back away, to close and bar the door, to retreat to the safety of her cabin and let the storm decide his fate. He was a stranger, a potential danger, and she owed him nothing. But as she stood there, frozen in indecision, her gaze fell on his hands. They were large and calloused, the hands of a man who knew hard work, but they were folded peacefully across his chest, a gesture of surrender, not aggression. In that moment, the image of a Daniel in his final days rose in her mind, the stillness, the quiet letting go, the slow fading of life as the fever took him. She could not, would not, leave another soul to face the cold alone. The decision was not made with her mind, but with a deeper, more elemental part of her being. The struggle to get him to the cabin was a nightmare of burning muscles and numb fingers. He was a dead weight, a solid mass of unconscious man that she dragged and heaved through the deepening snow, her own breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, more than once. She slipped and fell, the two of them collapsing into a heap in the snow, the biting wind finding every gap in her clothing. The thought of giving up, of leaving him there, flickered through her exhausted mind. But she pushed it away, fueled by a stubbornness she didn't know she had. Once inside, she collapsed on the floor for a moment before forcing herself to her feet. She worked with a desperate, focused energy, peeling away his frozen layers of clothing. His coat was heavy, made of fine wool, far better than that of any drifter she had ever seen. Beneath it, his shirt was of good quality linen, torn and stained but well made. She found nothing in his pockets but a small, empty leather pouch. She wrapped his inert form in every blanket and quilt she owned, and placed him as close to the roaring fire as she dared. For hours, she tended to him in a long, exhausting vigil. She brewed a strong broth with the last of her salted beef and the few herbs she kept, patiently spooning the warm liquid between his cracked, blue-tinted lips. She kept the fire fed, the constant task a rhythm that kept her own fear and exhaustion at bay. As she worked, she watched him, studying the lines of his face in the firelight. He was not a young man, but not old either. There were lines of weariness around his eyes, but his features were strong, well defined. She watched his chest rise and fall, praying with every breath, not a formal prayer, but a desperate, silent plea to whatever power governed this harsh land. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began. A faint touch of color returned to his cheeks. His breathing, once shallow and ragged, deepened into a slow, steady rhythm. Late into the night, as the storm finally began to exhaust its fury, his eyes flickered open. They were not the dull, vacant eyes of a man near death, but the color of a turbulent summer storm, a deep and shifting gray that seemed to hold a lifetime of untold stories. He tried to form a word, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. Clara placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly steady. "Rest now," she said, her voice soft but firm in the quiet of the cabin. "The storm is passing. You're safe." He held her gaze for a moment longer, a flicker of awareness, of questioning, in those gray depths, before his eyes closed and he slipped back into a deep, healing sleep. As she watched him, the stranger who now lay by her fire, Clara felt the profound and terrifying certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The wind had brought him to her door, and with him, a future she could not possibly have foreseen. For Clara Maeve Thorne, the days following the great blizzard unfolded in a strange, new rhythm. The world outside was a vast, silent expanse of white, but the world inside her small cabin was no longer entirely her own. The stranger, who had introduced himself simply as Cal, recovered his strength with a quiet, steady determination that she found herself secretly admiring. In the first few days, he was mostly silent, a convalescent content to watch her from his makeshift bed by the hearth, his storm-gray eyes following her movements as she went about her daily chores. But as his energy returned, a subtle shift occurred. He was no longer just a presence, but a participant. It began with small things. He would insist on taking over the task of keeping the fire fed, his large, capable hands stacking the logs with an efficiency that made her own efforts seem clumsy. He seemed to understand the nature of the fire, how to bank the coals at night so that a warm heart remained in the morning, a skill that had taken her months to learn through trial and error. Soon, he was moving about the homestead, and Clara began to witness a competence that was both remarkable and unsettling. He possessed an innate understanding of the mechanics of a working farm, as if the knowledge was etched into his very bones. He rehung the heavy barn door, which had sagged on its leather hinges for a year, not with brute force, but with the clever use of leverage and a fulcrum that Daniel, for all his strength, had never quite mastered. One afternoon, she found him in the barn, running a gentle, confident hand down the leg of her favorite milk cow, Bessie, who stood placidly under his touch. "She's been favoring this leg," he stated, not asking. "There's a bruise between the cleat of her hoof." Clara had noticed the slight limp, but had dismissed it as a minor strain. Cal, however, worked with the focused calm of a veterinarian, carefully cleaning the hoof and applying a poultice of crushed herbs he'd found growing near the creek. He seemed to see the world in terms of problems and solutions, of systems and efficiencies, and he moved to correct imbalances with a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. His help was a profound relief. Lifting a weight from her shoulders she hadn't realized she was carrying. Yet each display of his surprising skill added another layer to the mystery of who he was. Drifters and hired hands were common enough, but none possessed this combination of quiet refinement and deep, practical knowledge. The evenings became the heart of their new existence. With the chores done and the cabin secured against the biting cold, they would settle into a comfortable silence by the fire. It was in this shared quietude, warmed by the flickering light, that Clara found her own voice again, hesitantly at first, then with growing ease. She began to speak of Daniel. She spoke not just of the good man her neighbors knew, but of the dreamer, the man who saw an apple orchard on a barren slope and a dynasty in a handful of cattle. She spoke of his frustrations, his stubborn pride, and the quiet fears he had only ever confessed to her in the dead of night. Cal, in turn, proved to be an extraordinary listener. He would sit, carving a piece of cottonwood into the shape of a small horse, his gaze fixed on the fire, but his attention was entirely on her. He didn't offer the empty platitudes, a well-meaning but useless advice she had grown accustomed to hearing. Instead, he would ask questions. Did he enjoy the work itself, or the idea of what the work would bring? He asked one night, a question so insightful it made her pause. It forced her to see her own past with a clarity she hadn't found on her own. He wanted to expand, she explained another evening, her voice soft. Buy more land, introduce new bloodlines. But the financing, it was always a struggle. Cal looked up from his carving. Sometimes expansion isn't about acquiring more, but improving what you have. A smaller, healthier herd can be more profitable than a large, strained one. It's about managing resources, not just accumulating them. He spoke of cattle bloodlines and crop rotation with an authority that was startling, casually mentioning techniques and strategies that were far beyond the scope of a small homesteader. He caught himself then, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, and added, "Or so I've heard from men who know." Clara would listen, a small frown of puzzlement on her face, before tucking the anomaly away with the others. One night, she found him staring out the window at the northern sky, a strange intensity in his gaze. The wind will shift before morning, he said, more to himself than to her. We'll have a hard freeze, harder than usual. Best bring in extra wood. She had seen no sign, but she trusted the certainty in his voice. The next morning, the inside of the windows were coated in a thick layer of ice, and the air outside was so brittle it seemed to crackle. His foresight was just another piece of the puzzle she could not solve. Their isolated world was occasionally punctuated by visitors, each one highlighting the strange new dynamic in her home. Her neighbors, Sarah and Ben Miller, brought a freshly baked pie and an abundance of unsubtle questions, their eyes darting between Clara and the quiet man mending a harness by the fire. More disruptive were the visits from Mr. Abernathy, a widower from a large ranch to the south. He was a good man, respectable and kind, but his presence was a heavy weight in the small cabin. "Clara, my dear," he said during one visit, his large frame filling the room, "a woman can't be expected to manage all this alone." His gaze flickered dismissively toward Cal, who sat quietly by the fire, his presence acknowledged but not addressed. "It isn't proper. Having a man of unknown character under your roof, people will talk. Mr. Cal has been a great help to me," Clara replied, her voice quiet but firm, surprised by her own protective instinct. "His character has been nothing but honorable," Abernathy huffed, seeing her not as a person making her own choices, but as a problem he could solve. A sensible union between our properties would secure your future. He pressed on. He looked at her with the assessing eye of a man evaluating good breeding stock, seeing her as a solution to the problem of his own loneliness and the perceived problem of a widowhood. His well-intentioned proposals of a safe, predictable future only served to make the silent, respectful companionship of Cal feel more vital. Abernathy saw a widow in need of protection. Cal, it seemed, saw a woman of strength who was her own person. The turning point, the moment the fragile peace was fractured, came on a fiercely cold afternoon nearly a month into Cal's stay. A young man on a leathered horse arrived from Cheyenne, a rarity in the deep of winter. He carried a small, sealed envelope, a telegram that felt like an artifact from another world. "Message for a Mr. Advance," the boy announced, his breath pluming in the frigid air as he looked expectantly at Cal. "Urgent business from Denver," they said. The air in the yard went still. Cal, who had been inspecting the hoof of Clara's wagon horse, straightened up slowly. The easy, relaxed posture he normally held was gone, replaced by a sudden, sharp stillness. He walked over to the messenger, his expression a blank, unreadable mask. "You have the wrong man," he said, his voice level and cool, devoid of the warmth she had grown used to. "My name is Cal." He took the envelope from the boy's hand, his movements economical. He did not open it. He simply tucked it deep into the inner pocket of his coat. "There's no Vance here. You've had a long ride for nothing." He pressed a coin into the boy's hand and sent him on his way. Clara watched the entire exchange from the porch, her hands gripping the rough wood of the railing so tightly her knuckles were white. Vance. The name echoed in the silence that descended after the sound of the horse's hooves had faded. She didn't speak. She didn't ask the question that was screaming in her mind. Cal turned back to his work as if nothing had happened, but she saw the tension in the line of his shoulders, the way his movements were now just a little too deliberate. The easy companionship of the past weeks had evaporated, replaced by a thick, unspoken tension. That evening, dinner was a silent affair. The food, which she had prepared with care, tasted like ash in her mouth. They moved around each other in the small space of the cabin, careful not to touch, not to meet each other's eyes. The man who had shared her hearth, her grief, and her home was a stranger once more. The comfortable silence they had built together was now filled with the weight of an unspoken lie, and the seed of suspicion, once small and dormant, had begun to grow, its roots reaching deep into the foundations of her fragile, new-found peace. The tense silence that had fallen over the homestead after the messenger's departure stretched into the following days, becoming a thick and suffocating presence. For Clara Maeve Thorne, the very air in the small cabin felt charged with unspoken words, with the weight of the name Vance that hung between her and Cal like a physical barrier. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate courtesy, a pantomime of politeness that was a poor substitute for the easy companionship they had lost. The small cabin, once a haven of shared warmth, now felt like a stage where they were both playing a part. He would chop wood with a fierce, focused energy, the rhythmic thud of the axe a stark punctuation in the oppressive quiet, each swing seemingly a release for some deep, internal pressure he refused to voice. She, in turn, would knead bread with more force than necessary, her knuckles white against the dough, her thoughts a tangled mess of suspicion and a strange, unwelcome sense of betrayal. The easy conversations by the fire, once filled with stories of the past and quiet dreams for the future, had vanished. replaced by a guarded watchfulness that was more exhausting than any physical labor. The first visitor to break this new, strained quiet was Jedediah Croft, the director of the Cheyenne Bank. He arrived on a day when the winter sun was a pale, watery disk in the sky. His polished boots a stark contrast to the muddy, thawing ground of the yard. His demeanor was one of polished sympathy, his smile practiced, and his eyes as cold and gray as a river stone in the dead of winter. He spoke of his deep respect for the late Daniel Thorne, his words smooth and measured, and of the bank's admirable patience. Cal, who had been outside mending a fence with sharp, angry tugs, entered the cabin silently as Croft spoke, nodding once at the banker before settling into a chair in the corner, out of the direct line of sight, but a palpable presence nonetheless. His stillness was that of a predator, watchful and waiting, and it seemed to subtly alter the atmosphere of the room, charging it with a low, dangerous hum. "Miss Thorne," Croft began, settling into Daniel's chair without invitation, his presence seeming to shrink the cozy cabin. "I am here not merely as a representative of the bank, but as someone who understands the harsh realities of this land." He gestured vaguely toward the window, at the vast, unforgiving landscape. A woman alone, with such a significant debt. It is a heavy burden to bear. The winters here are not kind to those without substantial support. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost conspiratorial tone, as if sharing a great secret. "The bank has received an offer on this property, a generous one, I must say, enough to clear your mortgage entirely and leave you with a substantial sum to start a new, more suitable life back east, perhaps with family." The offer hung in the air, cloaked in the language of concern, but Clara felt its true nature. It was a threat, elegantly packaged. She felt a surge of defiance. This was her home, not a commodity to be traded. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "But I have every intention of seeing the winter through." From the corner of her eye, she saw Cal's hands, which had been resting on his knees, clench into tight, white-knuckled fists. Croft's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of annoyance in his eyes betrayed his frustration. "A commendable spirit, my dear," he said as he rose to leave. "But spirit does not pay debts. The bank's patience, unlike a Wyoming winter, is not endless. We will require a decision soon." His visit left a cold dread in the pit of her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. A week later, the sky turned a bruised, ominous gray, and the valley held its breath. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, fell completely silent. The animals grew restless, the cattle lowing nervously in the barn, the chickens scratching and pacing in their coop as if sensing the coming apocalypse. It was a silence more menacing than any storm, the deep, expectant hush before nature unleashed its full fury. The longest night began not with darkness, but with wind that returned with a scream, followed by a blinding wall of snow. A blizzard, more ferocious than any Clara had ever witnessed, descended upon the valley, erasing the world and isolating the small homestead completely. For 3 days and nights, they were prisoners of the storm. The cabin groaned under the assault, the timbers protesting against the immense weight of the snow that piled in deep, heavy drifts against the walls and roof. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that seeped through the walls and clawed at them with icy fingers, making their very bones ache. It was in this crucible of survival that the guarded courtesy between Clara and Cal was stripped away, burned off by the raw, desperate need to simply endure. They became a single unit, their movements economical and synchronized, a silent understanding passing between them in a shared glance or a simple nod. There was no time for suspicion or secrets when the immediate reality was a fight for survival. They secured the shutters, stuffed rags into the cracks around the door frame, and rationed their precious firewood, their hands often brushing in the cramped space, sending a jolt of awareness through the cold. They took turns keeping the fire alive, a lone, defiant beacon against the white fury outside. On the second night, a sound like a gunshot cracked through the roar of the wind, sharp and violent. A section of the barn roof, overburdened by the snow's immense weight, had splintered. Without a word, they bundled themselves against the elements and fought their way to the barn, working by the frantic, dancing light of a single lantern. They braced the weakened beams with spare timbers, their faces numb, their words snatched away by the wind, their bodies moving in a desperate, coordinated dance against the storm. Later, huddled back in the cabin, shivering and exhausted, they heard a faint, distressed cry from the lean-to. It was Bessie, her favorite milk cow, in labor too soon. For hours, they worked together in the dim, flickering light of the lantern, the storm a raging beast outside. Cal's surprising knowledge and calm hands guided the difficult birth, his low, steady voice murmuring encouragement to the laboring animal. A tiny, shivering calf was born into the heart of the blizzard. It was too weak, its breath a shallow flutter, its legs unable to hold it. Without a word, they carried it inside, laying it on a pile of blankets by the hearth. They took turns rubbing its fragile body with rough sacks, trying to stimulate its circulation and feeding it warm, diluted milk from a rag until, miraculously, its trembling subsided and it let out a soft, hopeful bleat. In that moment, watching the tiny creature struggle for life, they were not a widow and a stranger, but two people bound by a shared, fierce desire to protect something innocent. On the third night, the storm reached its zenith. The wind howled with an unholy fury, and the small cabin felt like a ship tossed on a frozen, roaring sea. They had done all they could. Now they could only wait. They sat by the fire, the rescued calf sleeping peacefully at their feet, a profound exhaustion settling over them, so deep it felt like it was in their marrow. In the flickering firelight, the barriers between them seemed to melt away, the secrets Cal carried. The grief Clara held, they were rendered insignificant by the overwhelming power of the present moment. He looked at her, his storm grey eyes reflecting the flames, and saw not a grieving widow to be pitied, but a woman of incredible, quiet strength and grace. She looked at him and saw not a mysterious drifter to be feared, but a partner, a man whose quiet presence had become her anchor in the storm. He reached across the small space between them, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. The gesture was tentative, questioning, asking for permission she didn't know how to give or deny. His touch was warm against her cold skin, and a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through her. Clara leaned into his touch, a silent answer, her eyes closing for a brief moment. The world outside roared, but inside the small cabin, a profound silence fell, a silence filled not with tension, but with a raw, shared vulnerability. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not one of passion, but of a deeper, more elemental connection. It was a recognition of shared survival, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of oblivion, a promise whispered without words in the heart of the storm. When they finally pulled apart, the wind still raged, but something inside the cabin had irrevocably shifted. The line between a grateful guest and a grieving host had been erased, replaced by a connection so powerful it was both terrifying and beautiful. They had survived the storm outside, but now a new, more complicated one was just beginning within the four walls of the cabin. In the aftermath of the blizzard, an unnerving quiet descended upon the homestead, a silence far more profound and complex than the one that had preceded the storm. For Clara Maeve Thorne, the world had been reborn in pristine white, a landscape of blinding, beautiful purity that seemed to mock the turmoil within her. The atmosphere inside the small cabin was thick with the tension of what had passed between them. The kiss, born of desperation and survival in the heart of the storm, had not cleared the air but had charged it, creating a new, more intimate, and far more dangerous territory. They moved around each other with a heightened, painful awareness, the easy companionship shattered by a moment of raw vulnerability. An accidental brush of hands while tending the fire, once a source of quiet comfort, now sent a jolt of memory and confusion through her. His touch lingered on her skin, a phantom warmth that warred with the cold reality of his secrets. Cal was quieter than ever, his gaze often distant, as if wrestling with a decision he was not yet ready to make. He would spend hours outdoors in the biting cold, checking fences that didn't need checking. His energy focused and intense, as if physical labor could somehow resolve the turmoil within him. Clara would watch him from the window, her heart a tangle of conflicting emotions, and the memory of his touch, the shared fight for survival. The quiet understanding in his eyes, it was a warmth that spread through her, a dangerous and seductive hope. But it was immediately followed by the cold chill of his secrets, the name Vance a constant, nagging whisper in the back of her mind. He was a good man, a kind man. She knew that with a certainty that went beyond logic. But he was not an honest one, and that contradiction was a chasm she did not know how to cross. When the snow had hardened enough for travel, a new resolve took root in Clara's heart. She could no longer live in this state of suspended animation, waiting for a truth he might never offer. She could no longer live with the ghost of the name Vance and the suffocating weight of Cal's secrets, fueled by a strength she hadn't known she possessed. A strength forged in the heart of the storm. She made the difficult journey into Cheyenne. She told Cal she was going for supplies, a simple lie that felt heavy and bitter on her tongue. A mirror of his own deceptions. He had simply nodded, his eyes unreadable, and helped her hitch the wagon, his touch gentle and familiar as he checked the harness, which only made the lie feel worse. The journey was arduous, the wagon wheels struggling through the deep, hard-packed drifts. The air so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. The vast, snow-covered landscape stretched out around her, beautiful and terrible in its indifference. The solitude of the journey gave her too much time to think. Her thoughts drifted from Daniel's quiet, steadfast love, a love as predictable and comforting as the sunrise, to the turbulent, magnetic pull of Cal, a force as unpredictable and dangerous as a winter storm. She would not be a passive victim of circumstance. She would seek the truth for herself. She spent a long, grueling day in the dusty, quiet halls of the county records office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and decaying leather. Her gloved fingers, numb with cold, traced the spidery script on old deeds and titles, the heavy ledgers of physical burden that mirrored the weight on her heart. Patiently, methodically, she began to piece together a disturbing puzzle. She found records of numerous land sales over the past year, all small homesteads, like her own, all located in strategic parts of the valley near water sources or controlling access to grazing lands, and all of them had been sold for prices far below their worth to a series of anonymous holding companies. with the transactions all facilitated by Jedediah Croft's bank. The pattern was too clear to be a coincidence. It was the blueprint of a silent, creeping conquest. Her final stop was the general store, a place of warmth and gossip, where she spoke with the wife of a homesteader who had recently sold his land and moved on. The woman's eyes were filled with a weary, haunted resignation. "Croft made it sound like we had no choice," she whispered, glancing around nervously as if the banker himself might materialize from the shadows. "The loan came due, and suddenly there were complications, fees we'd never heard of. He made us an offer, said it was the only way to avoid ruin. We lost everything we'd worked for. Mrs. Thorne, everything." Armed with this heartbreaking confirmation, Clara returned to her homestead. The long journey back, a blur of cold and grim determination. Her heart was a cold, hard knot of anger and apprehension. She was no longer just a grieving widow fighting to survive. She was a woman on the verge of uncovering a conspiracy. She found Croft already waiting for her, his horse tied to her fence post as if he owned the place. This time, he was not alone. Flanking him were two rough-looking men, their expressions sullen, their hands resting casually on the pistols at their hips in a way that was anything but casual. The pretense of civility was gone. "Mrs. Thorne," Croft said, his voice as sharp and cold as the winter air, "I trust you have reconsidered my generous offer. My clients are growing impatient." Clara faced him, the fear she should have felt replaced by a cold, clear anger that burned away all her doubts. "Your clients?" she asked, her voice steady and ringing with a strength that surprised even herself. "Or is it just you? Mr. Croft, is it you who has been pressuring families, creating false crises to force them to sell their land cheap?" Croft's face, for the first time, lost its polished composure. A flicker of genuine shock, quickly replaced by a dark, venomous fury, crossed his features. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low menace. "You are a foolish woman, meddling in affairs you do not understand. This valley is a harsh place for a woman alone. Accidents can happen. Fires, stray cattle. The cold. It would be a tragedy if something were to happen to you out here, with no one around to help." His men shifted their weight, their eyes hard and flat, and Clara knew this was no longer a battle of words. It was at that moment, as the threat hung thick and heavy in the air, that they heard the sound of approaching horses, not one, but many. A rhythmic thunder that grew steadily louder. Over the crest of the hill rode Cal, but he was not the quiet, unassuming man she knew. He rode at the head of a half-dozen riders, men who sat their saddles with the easy confidence of professionals, their eyes sharp and watchful. Beside him was a well-dressed gentleman in a city suit, whose demeanor radiated an air of calm, unshakable legal authority. He must have seen Croft's party approaching from the ridge where he had been working. A silent sentinel she hadn't known was watching over her. Cal dismounted with a fluid grace, his focus entirely on Croft, his storm-gray eyes now glacial, holding an authority that made the banker take an involuntary step backward. "Croft," Cal said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of command that cut through the tension. "Your business on this property is concluded." Before Croft could sputter a reply, the lawyer stepped forward, unrolling a large, detailed map of the Wind River Valley. With clinical precision, he laid out the entire scheme. He presented documents, contracts, and correspondence that proved Croft was using his position at the bank to systematically run a land grab, forcing homesteaders into foreclosure and then buying their properties for a pittance through a series of shell companies. "And who?" the lawyer asked, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. do you suppose has been the ultimate beneficiary of your scheme? But it was Cal who delivered the final, devastating blow. He stepped forward, his gaze finally meeting Clara's, and in his eyes, she saw a universe of regret. Weeks ago, he said, his voice meant for her alone, a quiet confession in the midst of the chaos. When I learned of your situation, I had my agent purchase your mortgage from the bank. You are in no danger of foreclosure. Clara, you never were. He then turned back to Croft, his voice rising with a cold, controlled fury that was more terrifying than any shout. As for the rest of this valley, he said, you have been attempting to steal land that is already under the protection of its rightful owner. He gestured to the map, to the vast tracts of land that surrounded her small homestead like an ocean. This land, he said, belongs to the Vance Cattle Company. He paused, his gaze returning to Clara, holding her captive, and I am Caleb Vance. The name, the one she had heard whispered in suspicion, now landed with the force of a physical blow. The quiet drifter, the competent farmhand, the man she had nursed back to health, the man she had survived a blizzard with, the man she had kissed in the firelight, it was all a lie. He was a magnate, a cattle baron, a man of immense power and wealth, playing a part in a humble cabin. The relief of being safe from Croft was instantly and completely consumed by the crushing weight of this deception. It was a betrayal so profound it hollowed her out, leaving nothing but a raw, aching void. She looked at Caleb Vance, a stranger in the familiar form of the man she had come to care for. And all the pain, all the confusion, all the shattered trust coalesced into two simple, broken words. Get out. For Clara Maeve Thorne, the silence that descended after Caleb Vance and his men rode away was a physical entity, a crushing weight that replaced the biting wind and the sharp-edged words. It pressed in on her, filling the vast, empty space where the confrontation had just occurred. She stood motionless in the snow, watching the last of the riders disappear over the ridge, her two uttered words. Get out, still hanging in the frigid air, a fragile, broken monument to a shattered trust. The world was suddenly too quiet. The threat of foreclosure, the menacing presence of Croft, all of it had been swept away, not by justice or perseverance, but by a wave of power and wealth so immense it was beyond her comprehension. She was safe, but she had never felt more lost. She moved mechanically, her body numb, her mind a maelstrom of conflicting images. The man who had gently rubbed warmth back into the limbs of a newborn calf was the same man who commanded a small army of riders. The man who had listened with such quiet intensity to her stories of Daniel was the same man who owned the very land she stood upon. She went inside the cabin, which now felt alien, a stage for a play in which she had been an unwitting actor. The chair he had sat in, the cup he had drunk from, the harness he had mended with his capable, calloused hands, each object was now an artifact of a lie, a testament to a deception so profound it tainted every shared memory, every quiet moment of companionship. That night, she did not cry. The hurt was too deep for tears. A cold, hard knot in her chest that felt like a permanent part of her. The days that followed were a blur of hollow routines. She fed the chickens, milked the cow, and tended the fire. But her actions were devoid of purpose. The homestead was hers now, legally and irrevocably secure. But the knowledge brought her no joy. The safety felt like a cage, one built by his wealth, reinforcing the very power imbalance she had just discovered. Her anger, when it finally came, was a hot, protective shell around the raw core of her hurt. How dare he? How dare he watch her struggle, listen to her fears about losing her home, all while knowing it was a problem he could solve with the stroke of a pen. The intimacy they had shared now felt like a violation, his quiet understanding a calculated performance. She replayed his confession, his careful words, and saw not regret, but the arrogance of a man so powerful he believed he had the right to play with her life for his own emotional education. 3 days after Cal's departure, a lone rider approached the homestead. It was the well-dressed lawyer from Denver. He dismounted, his demeanor professional and detached, and presented her with a leather portfolio. "Mr. Vance instructed me to deliver these to you," he said, his voice neutral. Inside were the official documents, the deed to her 160 acres, free and clear of all encumbrances, and papers establishing a trust in her name, containing a sum of money so substantial it seemed like a misprint. "Mr. Vance wished to ensure your financial security," the lawyer explained. "As compensation for the duress caused by the bank, and as a recognition of the value you and your late husband invested in this land, it is a gift. Mrs. Thorne, with no strings attached, regardless of your personal feelings toward my client." Clara accepted the papers with numb fingers. She felt no gratitude, only a fresh wave of humiliation. It felt like a transaction, a final settlement, a payment for services rendered, or a way for him to assuage his guilt. The money was not a gift. It was another wall between them, a monument to the chasm of wealth and power that separated their worlds. It was the final confirmation that she had been a temporary diversion, an interesting chapter in the life of a man who could afford to buy and sell entire valleys. She thanked the lawyer, her voice a cold, distant echo of its former self, and closed the door on his retreating back. Days later, driven by a restless, angry need to purge his presence from her home, she began to clean with a frantic energy. She scrubbed the floors, washed the bedding he had used, and packed away the few items he had left behind: a worn whetstone, a half-finished carving of a horse. It was as she was clearing the hearth, sweeping away the last of the cold ashes, that her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard, one she had always meant to have Daniel fix, prying it up out of a sudden, inexplicable curiosity. She found a small, protected space beneath, and nestled inside was a leather-bound journal. It was his. He must have hidden it there for safekeeping and forgotten it in his hasty departure. For a long while, she simply held it, the worn leather cool against her skin. Her first instinct was to throw it into the fire, to watch it burn, to destroy the last remnant of his deception and the final record of his time in her life. But a stronger, deeper need took hold, the need to understand, not to forgive, but to understand the why. Why would a man with everything go to such lengths with trembling hands? She sat down in her rocking chair, the very chair where she had watched him for so many nights, and opened the first page. The man who emerged from the pages of the journal was not the powerful cattle baron or the competent drifter. He was a stranger to both of those personas. The elegant, precise handwriting spoke of a soul drowning in a loneliness so profound it was almost a physical illness. He wrote of a life that was a gilded cage, of endless business meetings and hollow social functions, of people who saw only his name and his fortune, their smiles masks for their avarice. He wrote of his desperate plan to disappear for a while, to travel incognito, not as a game, but as a search for something real, something true. "I want to know if anyone can care for the man, not the name," one entry read, dated just a week before he had appeared at her barn. I want to remember what it feels like to be valued for a kind word or a helping hand, not for the balance in my bank account. I want to know if the man I was, before the money built walls around me, still exists, or has he been lost forever? Clara read late into the night, the fire burning low, the only sound the soft rustle of the turning pages. She read of his weariness, his disillusionment, and his profound hunger for a genuine human connection. This wasn't the confession of a liar, it was the bearing of a lonely heart. The deception was still a wound, but now she understood the fear that had driven it. He hadn't been lying to mock her. He had been lying to protect a fragile, desperate hope, the hope that someone, somewhere, might see him for who he truly was, without the blinding glare of his wealth. The anger in her heart, the hard, protective shell she had built around her hurt, began to crack. It was replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it felt like a physical ache. The tears she finally shed were not for her own sense of betrayal, but for the depth of his solitude. She finished the last page as the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, painting the snow-covered world in shade of soft gray and rose. The emotional landscape inside her had shifted completely. The anger was gone, washed away by a clear, aching understanding. His lie, while wrong, had not come from a place of malice or arrogance, but from a place of profound fear and vulnerability. He had been just as trapped as she was, albeit in a different kind of prison. She looked around the small cabin, at the deed that made it hers, at the journal that held his soul. And she knew she could not let the story end in this broken, desolate silence. It was not about forgiving the lie. It was about reaching for the man she now, finally, understood. Her next action would not be one of surrender, but of a strength and a choice that was entirely her own. She would go to him. For Clara Maeve Thorne, the dawn that broke after she finished the journal was not just the start of a new day, but the beginning of a new life, one she would choose for herself. The decision had crystallized during the long, quiet hours of the night, not through careful reasoning, but through a deeper knowing that settled in her soul. She dressed with purpose, choosing not a dress of mourning, but her sturdiest riding skirt and a warm wool blouse. This was not an act of impulse, but a calculated pilgrimage. The journey to the northeast, towards the heart of the Vance Cattle Company, took the better part of 2 days as she crested a final high ridge. The headquarters of the Vance Ranch spread out below her, an empire of dark timber and river stone. It was a world of immense power, the very world Cal had run away from. A kind-eyed cowboy approached as she rode into the main yard, tipping his hat. "I'm here to see Caleb Vance," she said, her voice clear. The cowboy's expression softened into a knowing smile. "I reckon you are. He's been hoping you'd come." He pointed not towards the grand mansion, but to a winding path that led to a small cabin by a rushing creek. "You'll find him there." Clara followed the path on foot. The cabin was small and simple, built of weathered logs that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The door opened before she could knock. Cal stood there, framed in the doorway, dressed in simple work clothes, the hope in his eyes fragile, warring with a deep, profound fear. "Clara," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "Hello, Cal," she replied softly. She walked past him into the cabin, which was simply furnished, with a stone fireplace and the familiar smell of coffee and wood smoke. This was not the lair of a cattle baron. This was the home of the man who had sat by her fire. "I've been doing some thinking," he said, his voice quiet. about truth and trust, and whether love can survive mistakes. And what conclusions did you reach? She asked. That I would rather spend the rest of my life earning your forgiveness than one more day living without you, he said, his voice raw with an honesty that pierced her heart. That I would give up all of this for the chance to chop wood in your yard again. I don't want you to give up anything, Cal, she said, and I'm not here for an apology. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, half-finished wooden horse he had been carving. I'm here for the man who made this, the man who was gentle with my animals and brave in a storm. He stared at the small carving. That man is a liar. Clara. No, she said, stepping closer. That man was afraid. I read your journal. I understand now. The admission seemed to break something loose inside him. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his large frame. I was so afraid, he whispered. Afraid that you'd see the money and not the man. Afraid that I'd lose the only real thing I'd ever found. You haven't lost me, she said softly. But if we're going to do this, it has to be built on truth. No more secrets. He opened his eyes, and she saw her own resolve reflected back at her. No more secrets, he agreed. Then I have a proposition for you. Caleb Vance, she said, her voice gaining strength. I am a woman with a homestead and a dream of breeding horses. I am in need of a partner, someone who understands the land and isn't afraid of hard work. A slow, wondrous smile began to spread across his face. She held his gaze, her heart full and steady. I am not asking the great cattle baron to rescue me. I am asking the man who taught me how to survive a blizzard if he will come home with me and build a life. As my husband, as my equal. For a long moment, he was speechless, his storm-gray eyes wide with a wonder that seemed to erase all the weariness from his face. He knelt before her then, taking her hands in his touch no longer tentative, but sure and strong. Yes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, Clara, yes to everything. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate joy of a man who had thought he'd lost everything and discovered he'd found more than he'd ever dreamed possible. And when she kissed him back, it was with the full confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was choosing. And why? Outside the small cabin, the sun shone brightly on the melting snow. The wind still swept through the Wind River Valley. But for Clara and Cal, it no longer sang a song of loneliness. It whispered of shared dreams, of second chances, and of a love that had finally found its home.